Hey woodworkers. So after I sanded everything with 320, I need to go back and sand with a slightly finer grit. So I've got, still using wet dry or silicone carbide paper. I've got a sanding block to keep things flat, and I could just go across and sand with the grain. But instead of, I find that it's really helpful to lift some of the dried finish, as well as keeping it from building up in the abrasive by using a lubricant. So this, just like everything woodworkers do, is debatable as far as which is the best kind. For me, I like using mineral spirits here. I have used oil in the past, and even mineral oil, and even a mineral oil that's been diluted with mineral spirits is probably a better than most situation. The downside of that is just that it takes so long for it to really dry, and if you're using water-based finishes, sometimes the mineral spirits can start to give trouble to soften that finish. The other thing is that soapy water. A lot of people like soapy water, and I think it's probably easier to use, but it would have to be diluted in such a way that it really doesn't build up. That soap can sometimes cloud the visual of what you're trying to get, so you're trying to get some feedback as far as what the finish looks like. So anyway, mineral spirits to me is probably the best. So with the grain, just kind of distributing this here a little bit, and I'll continue to work this thing around until I've cleaned up the scratches from the last step. You'll notice that I have a spotlight here doing its thing. With doing any of this without light just kind of kills the whole process, and so you need to really be able to see what you're doing. I've got a couple of different lights and locations here so I could see this. Alright, you all know how to sand. I'm sure this is exhilarating. Alright. So visual inspection here that I'm not getting any corns at all, which is good. Two things I'm doing right in order to avoid this. Number one is I've let the finish cure long enough. This is an oil-based finish, so for that it's about 7 days, give or take. Other finishes are a little bit faster. Some are right in that 5 to 7 realm. Most of them are in that 5 to 7 realm. Okay, so next step here is going from 400 to 600. What I want to do is clean up any of the scratches that we've created just now. I need my box of rags, which was not handy. Alright, so clean soft cloth. I just want to remove any of this stuff as much as I can. It's okay that if I do have any of this abrasive slurry, it's still in there. I'm not worried about that. I just don't want any of this to be left for when I get to the next sandpaper, which is 600. I don't want those to mix. So, alright. 600, I'll do the same business. Oops. It's starting to look really nice. The thing that's a little bit misleading about using any of these lubricants is that I don't want to have any camouflage of what the surface looks like. And so I really need to rub all of this away and dry it so that I can see exactly what's going on with the wood. And it's really easy to get overly confident and kind of skip a step here or skip a part of the process. All right, so now just going with the 600, back and forth. Nothing wrong if you wanted to go across the grain. In some ways that might be better to kind of see where you're running into some trouble if you are. But for such a small surface here, I can address this pretty easily. The one problem that I think a lot of people run into at this stage is that they are using a backing piece here, a sanding block, which is good, but then they start to get overly confident and start rounding these corners. And then coming off the end here, it's really easy to start dipping this thing down, which will start to burn through your finish faster than anything else. And it would need to be repaired before you can go to the next thing, which is not the end of the world. It just, well, kind of suck, especially if you have a deadline you're trying to keep to get this delivered. Okay, all right, still looks good. Gonna get another clean cloth here. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so after I've done my sanding, there's really not much more I could do with this. A lot of people, I shouldn't say a lot, let me rephrase that. Higher sandpaper is commercially available, so you can get up into the thousands with 1200 grit and 2000 grit wet dry paper, and that's tempting, but the thought about sanding this by hand with those grits, even with the machine, it just seems excessive. So there's a couple of other options that are commercially available. One are these Scotch-Brite pads, and these typically come in a couple of different grits, for lack of a better word. The white is the least aggressive, so I'll end with that. There's also green and gray. The green is a bit more aggressive, and I think that's comparable to a 3/0 steel wool. So anyway, rubbing this thing in, we're always trying to make finer and finer scratches. That's the whole purpose here. So steel wool. Steel wool has historically been used and loved by wood finishers because of its abrasive qualities. The problem with steel wool, well, problems, plural, is it doesn't do great with all finishes. If you're using steel wool and you're recoating with a water-based finish, any of those little fibers or particles will get trapped in the finish and then they'll start to rust. If you have an open pored wood, sometimes the same problem happens where it gets captured in there, and then over time and humidity it starts to rust in place. Not ideal. Anyway, so talking about Scotch-Brite pads, they also make synthetic steel wool, and I haven't used steel wool ever since I got this stuff. This is pretty fantastic, and this comes in different grits as well, and so this would be what I would use after the Scotch-Brite. But Scotch-Brite pad, there's still plenty of lubricant here on the surface, and I would just rub this back and forth, again, making finer and finer scratches and trying to get this surface consistent now. It's already smooth, but I want it to be consistent because the sheen is the part that could be somewhat erratic. And so I want this to have a nice consistent sheen everywhere. And you can do this dry, but it cuts a little bit faster when dry. And so cutting it, using some type of lubricant here will have this kind of float on the surface a little bit. And that's what I'm after. All right, so that one looks great. Same thing here. You use the white. You really can't overdo it with the lubricant material here. All right, white pad, all the same tricks. All right, that goes there. So my last step in the abrasive process is just going to be the synthetic steel wool stuff, and I'll do all the same stuff. This one I always kind of want to end with going with the grain. I should also say there are different abrasives with the synthetic steel wool. I have 3 different grits, but I typically just end up using this gray. It's a nice in-between for the Scotch-Brite, and then my final step, which is going to be using a polisher. Okay. One more wipe to get the stuff clean. Let me know if there's any surprises before I get to the last stage. I will also need to let this stuff really dry. And so letting the solvent dry is going to be the most laborious part here, and something I can control the least. I usually use vinegar in here to try to clean it up, but you can kind of see, oops, you can kind of see how this is kind of starting to come alive, I hope. And if you'll notice the reflection of this light, this is the best gauge of how you're doing with the sheen. If it starts to get dull in one area or another, or if it's doing fine and then maybe there's a stripe here where it's much duller, then you'll know that you have missed that area. You need to give it more attention. All right, that's that. I'm going to continue doing this a little bit more on the other end, which I didn't address here. And then I'll talk to you about the last step, which is going to be the polishing. All right, see you in a bit.